السلام عليكم ومساء الخير جميعا. مرحبا بكم في هذه الجلسة حول إمكانية تحقيق السلام في اليمن. لا أريد حقيقة أن أطيل عليكم بالمقدمات، لدينا وقت قصير جدا في هذه الجلسة ولدي نخبة من المتحدثين الذين بلا شك سيقدمون لنا رؤاهم بشكل عميق. أريد فقط أن أشارككم تجربتي الخاصة في زيارة اليمن. عندما زرت اليمن حقيقة وجدت ثلاث أمور رئيسية. الأول، وجدت أن هناك حالة من الفقر هي عامة، بمعنى أنه ليس هناك كنتون اجتماعي هو الذي يعاني من الفقر، بل الفقر هو السمة العامة التي يتعامل معها المجتمع. وجدت حالة سلاح بالنسبة لي كشخص يأتي من الخليج غريبة. السلاح كان هو الحالة الطبيعية أيضا، كل مكان تذهب تجد الناس تستخدم السلاح. ووجدت كذلك حالة عدم استقرار في التعامل مع الشأن السياسي. كل هذا كان في عام 2008. لم يكن هناك حرب، كان هناك استقرار سياسي، وكان الاقتصاد طبيعي. اليوم وبعد كل هذه الظروف وهذه الحرب المستمرة التي تضمنت وباء بالإضافة إلى التحديات العسكرية والاقتصادية، هل يمكن لليمن أن يحقق سلاما مستداما في مرحلة قادمة؟ هذا هو السؤال الذي نتمنى أن يجيب عليه الزملاء معنا اليوم على المنصة، وكلهم معرفون لديكم في كتيبات المؤتمر، لذلك سأختصر التعريفات وأحفظ الألقاب. سنبدأ بداية مع السيدة هيلين لاكنر، واسمحوا لي أن نتحول للغة الإنجليزية مع المتحدثين سيقدمون أوراقهم باللغة الإنجليزية. Ms. Lackner, the internal dynamics of Yemen are probably as complicated as the regional dynamics playing a part in this crisis. Can you talk to us a little bit about how these two intertwine into the crisis we have now, and can we reach a sustainable peace that is integral and organic in Yemen rather than imported?
Okay, thank you very much for asking me and for introducing me. And I'd just like to start off, before talking specifically about the internal issues, to remind everybody that they're actually quite closely connected to the overall security issues that have been raised in most of the other sessions. But I will look much more at the origins. Basically, if you don't have a good civil society, you don't have a functioning economy, you don't have a functioning society, you have the basis for instability and the major problems that we have here today in Yemen and elsewhere. So I think, although I will talk about very specifically Yemeni aspects, this is not entirely irrelevant, as I think Dr. Majid just explained. Before I start talking about politics, I just want to make 2 or 3 points that people always should remember when thinking about Yemen. And they are figures that are almost the same. 70% of Yemen's population still live in rural areas, mostly in very small settlements. That is a very important factor. The second point is, like many other societies in this part of the world, 70% or thereabouts of the population are very young. And the third one, to add to the 70%, is that nowadays one can say at least 80% of the population are poor. These are all factors that need to be really taken into consideration. However, the country has considerable potential, and those of us who know it know how incredibly beautiful the landscapes are, how incredibly generous the people are, and how much potential it would have in a number of sectors: agriculture, tourism, culture, and I think Rafat later will talk much more about the economy. However, Yemen faces a number of very fundamental constraints, and one of them is this very serious and dramatic scarcity of water, which means that should water not be managed efficiently, which it isn't at the moment, there will be a situation within less than a generation where a lot of people will no longer be able to live there. It also has very limited natural resources. For those who know it, the maximum oil production was 400,000 barrels a day. It was down to about 180 or 160 before the crisis started. This is for a population of between 25 and now 30 million people, which means it has very basic implications on the amount of investment that can be done. Again, something I'm sure Rafat will deal with very efficiently later. And finally, the skill level in Yemen is very low. And that prevents Yemen at the moment from operating and acting with most of the modern economy, which is the sector that most people would want to work with. So now I'll go very briefly into the origins of the current crisis, and that means going back to the last 2 or 3 decades. And politically, the main fundamental issues were first, a very closed elite group which had different factions and which was closely allied with former President Saleh, and which did not allow the emergence of new political forces. And I think that was one of the basic constraints that affected Yemen's development. So there was no renewal of the political class. The second one was a very stalemate which emerged at the end of the last decade between the 2 main political groups, one of them the GPC of President Saleh, and the other one, the joint opposition, bringing together a number of different parties who were unable to agree on constitutional reform and on an electoral mechanism that would have allowed for elections which were very severely delayed. And third, and connected to these, is the fact that we were at that time at the end of one generation, and there was the emergence of a new generation of leaders within the ruling families, which allowed the potential of problems to arise. Now, before I move on from politics, I'd just like to say a few words about tribes. People are often saying Yemen's a tribal society, all the problems in Yemen are due to the tribes. The tribes are dreadful outfits which are backward and, can't think straight, and they have a bad influence. This is just not correct. Tribes are a form of social organization. People who are members of tribes are also members of professions, of activities, of political parties. And, tribes are not to be treated either as separate entities or despised in any way. They still have, to a large extent, elements of solidarity, which are extremely important, even though these have been somewhat deteriorating in the past few decades, unfortunately. That's another topic I could go into at great length. Now, on the economic situation, sorry. As I mentioned, oil production had gone down. There was no modern economy. And particularly in the rural areas, the size of land holdings had dropped very dramatically, so that people were no longer able to live from their small holdings and their livestock. And many, many people, in fact, most of the rural income was from people working as casual laborers in the towns, except for those who were really lucky and had managed to emigrate internationally. And the social problems that the country has faced were, one, it's had a consistently high population growth of almost 3% per annum, which means the population doubles in 20 years. As I mentioned earlier, the levels of education are very low, and we have a high level of illiteracy. Sorry to be skipping over these incredibly important subjects, but I'm supposed to tell you all about Yemen in 5 minutes. If you want to know more, there's a book that I can hand out.
Thank you.
Which gives you more details.
Thank you, Ms. Lackner. We appreciate it. You've gone over the 5 minutes.
I've gone over the 5 minutes. I haven't even got to the current situation. Shall I go to the current situation?
Well, can we do it in the second round, if you don't mind?
Okay.
Ms. Lackner, yes.
Sorry.
And of course, Ms. Lackner just published Yemen in Crisis, Autocracy, Neoliberalism, and the Disintegration of a State. So if you want more than 5 minutes, this is the place to go. وهذا ينقلنا حقيقة إلى زميلنا سعيد ثابت وهو مدير مكتب الجزيرة في اليمن. أستاذ سعيد لو تحدثنا يعني كيف يمكن أصلا أن نتحدث عن سلام في اليمن في ظل صراع إقليمي دولي ينعكس على وكلاء محليين لهذه القوى الإقليمية، وهل تعتقد هناك في الحقيقة فرص لأن يكون هناك توافق بين هذه القوى الإقليمية السعودية الإمارات أمريكا الولايات المتحدة يعني إيران قبل أصلا أن يفتح باب التفاهم بين الشرعية من جهة والانتقالي من جهة
issues before we open the space for negotiations between the Houthis and the Yemenis. To observe time, I have jolted a number of points, and I can say through our monitoring of the civil war that it reached a dead end, an impasse. There is no political solution or military solution in the horizon, or at least in the foreseen future, and there is no chance for political
بشكل جذري. وبالتالي هذه الحالة المراوحة تضع البلد في استمرارية الصراع محتمل بشكل كبير. طبيعة الحرب في اليمن أصلاً هي خليط غير متوازن من حرب داخلية وصراع خارجي على النفوذ. هذا الصراع القائم ليس مستقل بحد ذاته، هو وجه مركب يتعدد فيه أكثر من طرف، الطرف المحلي والطرف الإقليمي والطرف الدولي. وبالمناسبة تأثير كل كتلة منها يختلف، لكن في نظرنا أن التأثير الدولي في هذا الصراع هو الفاعل والحاكم عليه. فيما يأتي التأثير الإقليمي الذي تمثله عدد من الأطراف الإقليمية في المحيط، سواء كانت السعودية أو إيران أو الإمارات أو غيرهم، تأثير لاحق لكنه يتداخل مع التأثير المحلي. بمعنى التأثير الإقليمي في الصراع يتداخل إلى حد ما، إلى درجة قد تصل إلى التشابك مع التأثير المحلي الداخلي بسبب فعل وجود الأدوات والوكلاء الذين صاروا تجلي للتأثير الإقليمي. لكن هناك تحولات طبعا جيوسياسية شهدتها البلد منذ ما قبل الوحدة، لكن نستطيع أن نقول من عام 90 إلى عام 2011 كانت مرحلة من الصراع الداخلي الكبير، تجلى بعد ذلك ما يسمى بثورة الربيع. ويستطيع المرء أن يقول أن الصراع في اليمن من أحد تجلياته هو أنه يأتي في سياق الثورة والثورة المضادة في ظل رواد الربيع العربي. لكنه في المقابل هناك وجه آخر للصراع قديم يتمثل في التنافس النفوذ في اليمن بحكم الموقع الجيوسياسي لليمن، خاصة أن اليمن تحتل موقع استراتيجي كبير، سواء كانت على المنطقة أو قارة آسيا أو حتى القارة الأفريقية من خلال موقعها. تمظهرات الحرب في اليمن يعتبر طبعا المستوى الخارجي فيها أبرز المستويات والمؤثرة فيها ويزداد حدة، ولذلك تجد أن كثير من الدول الكبرى ترى في بقاء هذا الحرب ودوميمته مصلحة لها من خلال عدد من هذه التجارب، منها أن استمرار الحرب يتيح لها فرصة البيع للسلاح وتصديره، ممارسة مزيد من الضغط السياسي للدول المنخرطة في هذا الصراع، الدول الإقليمية، بفعل انتهاكها لحقوق الإنسان، وأيضا تستفيد من خلال التوجهات والأجندات الدولية في تشكيل خارطة الشرق الأوسط التي ترسم في هذه المرحلة، بحيث يتم هندسة القاعدة الجغرافية السياسية لمنطقة الوطن العربي، بالتحديد اليمن، باعتبارها تقع على بحر العرب والمحيط الهندي، وهي قاعدة لمعمار تشكيل الكيانات السياسية الحديثة، كما حدث في بداية القرن الماضي عندما تشكلت الدول القطرية وفق سايكس-بيكو. تم ترسيمها منذ أول دولة من أوائل الدول القطرية تشكلت كانت اليمن، بمعنى في 1918 مع انتهاء الحرب العالمية الأولى شكلت المملكة المتوكلية. هناك يتضاءل طبعا دور تأثير القوى الإقليمية مقارنة بالقوى الدولية، ويتضاءل أي في المقابل دور التأثير المحلي للحكومة الشرعية والأحزاب وغيرها مقارنة بالقوى الإقليمية. القوى الإقليمية بالتحديد السعودية والإمارات وإيران، وكل وكيل له يمارس عملية تأثير كامل. طيب نكمل مرة ثانية.
أوكي،
نحن منتظمين.
شكرا لك سعيد على الالتزام بالوقت. I'd like to welcome Mr. Mark Lowcock, who is the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator at the United Nations. Although he arrived late, he will also need to leave early. But we are very happy to hear from him now. As you know, Mr. Lowcock, there is a lot of blame that's targeted to the UN on the situation in Yemen in many respects. I'm quite sure that as a UN official yourself, and responsible for humanitarian issues, you have seen a lot of the complications of the humanitarian situation in Yemen. How does the UN factor into that humanitarian crisis, into the solution, of course, of the humanitarian crisis? And is there a prospect for solving this humanitarian side of the crisis beyond the political situation?
Well, thank you very much. Good to be with you all today again at the Doha Forum. Well, Martin Griffiths, the UN Secretary-General Special Envoy for Yemen, and I briefed the Security Council again on the situation in Yemen on Thursday last week. So let me just share with you the highlights of our briefing, which touches on both the questions you've asked. Clearly, the context is a very bad, incredibly damaging civil war that's played out now for a number of years. And 2018 in particular was an exceptionally bad year. 2019 has also been a bad year. But in a number of respects, we do see some signs of progress and some hope that maybe 2020 can be a better year. So, for example, the levels of violence in 2019 are lower overall than they were in 2018. We've seen some reconciliation of differences in the south of the country. We've seen the opening up of some dialogue between key parties. On the humanitarian situation, Yemen is the world's worst humanitarian crisis. It's been that for the last 2 or 3 years. It will be that again in 2020, but we are projecting an improvement in terms of the number of the amount of money we will need to keep the humanitarian situation stable next year. The UN, to be direct in answering part of your question, the UN is part of the solution here. The UN has not created this problem, but the UN is helping manage it and solve it. Every month, UN agencies are providing food to 12 million people in Yemen. We're providing health services to more than 1 million Yemenis a month. We're providing clean water and sanitation to 7 million. And the situation is very, very bad, but without that assistance, it would be much worse, I'm afraid. We can only do that because our appeal this year is relatively well funded. We've raised more than $3 billion, 83% of what we were saying would be necessary to keep the situation stable this year. And we deliver this huge program, the world's largest humanitarian response program, despite the ongoing conflict and despite a lot of interference and obstacles put in our way by parties on all sides. I think 2020 can be a better year. Whether it is or not depends above all on the ongoing talks. There is one major issue everybody should keep an eye on in addition to the finance we will need next year to keep the humanitarian situation, and that's the situation on the economy. And I'm sure other people are going to touch on this as well, but I just want to flag as one of the points that Martin Griffiths and I made to the Security Council on Thursday. Having watched at this time last year basically the collapse of the economy because of a desperate shortage of foreign exchange, we're now starting to see the warning signs again of a similar problem emerging. The rial has depreciated by 10% just in the last several weeks, back to the 600 rial to the dollar rate, compared with 215 rials to the dollar before the conflict started. Why is that? Well, it's because Yemen has lost almost all its ability to generate foreign exchange. The economy's been destroyed, oil and gas exports have plummeted, agricultural exports have plummeted. Yemen is entirely reliant, really, on external actors to provide resources in the form of foreign exchange in order to be able to finance essential food and fuel imports. And when the exchange rate starts to slide, as it's done in the last several weeks, that is an indicator that there's a desperate shortage of foreign exchange. So I think that's one of the things that if we don't want to see a deterioration in the situation in the next few months, really needs to be dealt with now. But overall, compared to how I and Martin Griffiths felt about this problem at the end of 2017, at the end of 2018, we do see more signs now that the key players want to see the beginnings of resolution. So we do hope 2020 will be a better year. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lockwood. ويعني مع هذه الخاتمة الاقتصادية لحديث سعادة الأمين العام المساعد ننتقل للأستاذ رافت الأكحلي وهو وزير الشباب والرياضة السابق في الحكومة اليمنية والزميل الممارس في المشاريع الاستراتيجية في كلية بالباتنيك للدراسات الحكومية. سيد رافت، يعني لا شك أن المشكلة الاقتصادية في اليمن ليست وليدة هذه الأزمة، ولكنها تعززت بشكل كبير جدا في هذه الأزمة. هل يمكن الحديث عن اقتصاد يمني قادر على يعني المساهمة في سلام مستدام في اليمن؟
See an economy in Yemen that could resolve the conflict and sustain. I will speak in English.
I think you've done my job already, because my job was to say that the economy is the number one issue that should be focused on. My job was to say it's the economy, stupid, as President Clinton once said. But clearly, everyone almost agrees that the economy is the issue we should be looking at. One of the main drivers of the conflict, as Dr. Majid mentioned, is the very high level of poverty we always had in Yemen. About 50% before the war started was the poverty rate in Yemen. And so because of that, and because of the lack of productive jobs in the economy, and because of all the issues that Helen mentioned as well, was one of the main drivers why there is a fertile ground for continued conflicts again and again that keep springing in Yemen. This is not the first conflict, of course, but it is one of the longest and most devastating in the past couple decades, at least. And so when we look at what happened during the conflict, of course, the war and the conflict itself had a huge impact on the economy. So from 50% poverty to 80% poverty, GDP slashed by half. We can see loss of jobs all across. So jobs in the public sector, people are not getting paid for at least 2.5 years now, close to 3 years. Companies are shutting down, private sector, about 25, latest World Bank study, 25% of businesses shut down, about 50% had to downsize. We look at the agriculture sector, the largest employer, about 50% loss of jobs there. And so you can clearly see the impact of people, on people of the conflict, because on one side, no source of meaningful income, and on the other side, skyrocketing prices and inflation that is happening. As Mark mentioned, the exchange rate was one thing, but you look at the prices of food, for example, on average above 100% increase in food prices, around 200% in fuel. And so that is the impact of the conflict on the Yemeni citizen. That's what the Yemeni citizen feels. But there are two issues that I wanted to point at, because in parallel with what is happening, there is also a war economy that has been created by this. There are people who are making money out of this war on both sides of the conflict. And this is one of the key challenges to achieving peace, or to the prospects of peace. And so unless we start addressing the war economy, the economic war as well, because both sides are using the economy as a tool to advance their own objectives. And finally, the impact of the war on the economy. So these three things, if we don't start looking at it and addressing it, there's very little prospects for peace. And I want to end by one thing. If you look at all the previous peace agreements over the past at least 3 decades of Yemen's existence, from the 1990 Unity Agreement to 94 to 90, to then 2011, the GCC Agreement, and to all the agreements after, they have 2 factors in common. One factor is that they all failed in achieving any sort of sustainable peace. And the other factor is they all did not have an economic component to them. It was strictly an elite power-sharing deal that tried to satisfy the elites. But people did not get anything out of it, which, again, we are seeing, whether it's with the Riyadh Agreement, which had a very shy mention of a couple points related to the economy. We are seeing with the peace process so far led by the UN. And unless we have this component, I go back to what Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, said in the opening. He said, we have to move from beggar thy neighbor to prosper thy neighbor. And this is the key piece that I want to leave you with, is unless we start and the region as well, and all the countries that are wanting peace in Yemen starts looking at this aspect. How can we build a peace that has a dividend for people, that has an economic component of it, that integrates the Yemeni economy to the wider region, that builds that builds the incentive for people to continue peace, not just the elites, because the elites will always have their political issues that have been running for so long, but people need to have a stake in peace, and that is, I think, the one aspect that is missing so far, and if we can put more emphasis on it, we would succeed.
Thank you, Rafat. I think now we have a very clear basis for the discussion, but we only have 20 minutes till the end of the session. So I don't know how much we can accomplish. I want to give 2 minutes to Helen to complete the idea she was saying about the current situation, and then we can move to other speakers. Yeah, well, I'm sorry, we lost 10 minutes from the beginning, so.
Yeah, well, I think, I think everything that's been said, particularly by Rafat and Mr. Lowcock, are very, very important factors. I would just briefly want to try and point out the current political groups you have in Yemen internally and the implications this has for future peace, on the assumption that the Saudi Arabians and the Emiratis withdraw and or agree to a deal, which I'm sure Saeed will talk about much more clearly. So basically, you know, you have a whole section of Yemen, which is about 1/3 of the area, but 2/3 of the population, which is controlled by the Houthis. And the Houthis are basically controlling what you could call a very tight police state. And their rule is not a particularly agreeable rule. But on the other hand, many people nowadays say that Sana'a is a safer place to be than Aden. So I think that is very important. What we need to remember is that the Houthis, like any other political organization, can also be divided, and that they have their differences, which may not have emerged prominently recently, but are likely to emerge as there's discussions of peace. The final element on the Houthis is really that the Houthis may need the war to go on. I think, in my view, the Saudis are seriously planning to get out, but I'm not sure that the Houthis will actually make it possible for them to get out, or at least to get out easily. And on the other hand, when we look at the liberated areas, we also have a very considerable series of divisions, and the area is much more divided indeed than the Houthi-controlled area. First, we have the northern part, and that includes Hadramaut and Wadi Hadramaut and various other places that are under considerable influence of Islah and Vice President Ali Mohsen. And further south and west, we have the numerous separatist groups, indeed one of whom has just signed the Riyadh Agreement. And I'd just like to conclude by pointing out that the Riyadh Agreement, from its implementation for the first 7 weeks, does rather remind one of the Stockholm Agreement that was signed a year ago, almost to the day. A very limited implementation, a lot of positive talk from people who are promoting it, but very little actually happening on the ground. And I think the evidence doesn't suggest that either of these will achieve very much. I'm sorry to end on a pessimistic note. And I'll...
Thank you. On that pessimistic note, Saeed, can you link the regional players' end games, respective end games, to this internal dynamic that Helen was talking about?
أود أن أؤكد على أن الحرب في اليمن ليست مسألة اقتصادية محضة أو أنها ملف إنساني، هي قضية سياسية بامتياز نتيجة تدخلات أدت إلى كوارث اقتصادية، إلى الفقر، إلى الجوع، إلى المجاعة. هذه نتائج الحرب وليست هي سبب الحرب. النقطة الثانية، هناك أطراف إقليمية. أولا حكم نسميها لعنة الجغرافيا بالنسبة لليمن. اليمن واقعة في منطقة الخليج، هي تقترب اتحاد السعودية واتحاد عمان، وهاتان
to
الدولتان
Saudi Arabia
داخل
and
منظومة
Oman,
مجلس
and
التعاون
those
الخليجي
two
تمثلان مدرستين مختلفتين داخل مجلس التعاون الخليجي. هذا الموقع الجغرافي يؤثر كثيرا في العلاقة المحيط داخل اليمن. اثنين، فيما يتعلق بالأطراف، السعودية لديها تاريخيا لديها أطماع توسعية معروفة داخل اليمن، وكان في ديسمبر 2014 أصدرت المملكة مرسوما بإخلاء أو بإلغاء محافظة الخرخير في نجران وجعلها منطقة نفط خاص ونقل السكان فيها، بحكم أن هذه المنطقة قريبا من المهرة، وكان المشروع مع بداية الحرب في 2014 أن يمد الأنبوب الكبير فيه. من أهم الأدوات التي تستخدمها المملكة العربية السعودية موضوع هاجس إغلاق مضيق هرمز وتأمين مصالحها الاقتصادية إلى الشرق إلى الصين وغيرها من خلال بحر العرب. الثاني، السعوديون مشكلة اليمن أيضا التدخلات الإقليمية والدولية في الأدوات الداخلية، بمعنى أن الحرب ليست يمنية خالصة، هي حرب إقليمية دولية على الأرض اليمنية، تصفية حسابات داخلية. الثالث أو الرابع، الإمارات هي بهدفها الرئيسي لدخولها اليمن، وهي دور مستحدث لم يكن معروفا من قبل، إلا أنها في الفترات الأخيرة لديها تطلعات ونزعات توسعية لا تتناسب مع حجمها، لكنها تريد بالمقام الأول منافسة المملكة العربية السعودية في مجالها الحيوي وهو اليمن، من خلال لعب دور كبير بصناعة الوكلاء والأدوات في موازاة الإيرانيين الذين يشتغلون على الأدوات، بينما السعودية تشتغل من دون وكلاء مباشرين أو واضحين. الإمارات لديها المجلس الانتقالي والأحزمة الأمنية، الإيرانيون لديهم الحوثيون وأدواتهم الواضحة، السعودية ليس لديها كيان واضح لكنها تشتغل على أكثر من جبهة، من خلال الحكومة الشرعية، من خلال بعض الأحزاب، من خلال بعض مشايخ القبائل، لكن ليس كيانا تنظيميا واضحا تشتغل كوكيل مباشر. لهذا تجد التعثر الآن السعودي مقارنة بالنجاح الإماراتي في داخل المحيط اليمني، وأيضا النجاح الإيراني في المحيط، مع توضيح بسيط أن سريعا فقط معذرة لو خلف، الحوثيون لا يحكمون شمال اليمن بالحقيقة، ولا يحكمون معظم السكان اليمن، هم يحكمون شمال الشمال، وهذا عدد السكان ليس بشكل كبير. يعني السكان هو اليمن الشمالي ينقسم إلى شمال وجنوب، واليمن الطبيعي يمن شمال ويمن وسط ويمن جنوب. الوسط والجنوب ليس في حدود سيطرة كاملة للحوثيين، لذلك حرب الوكلاء داخل اليمن هي الفاعلة أكثر مما حرب
So the war, it is between the proxies rather than between local or internal powers.
In this political turmoil, can we envision that the politicians who are involved in this conflict, internally and externally, can help with the humanitarian crisis? And to what extent do you think that the regional players are hampering humanitarian efforts? I know as a UN official you're not able to divulge a lot of political opinion, but I'm asking for the maximum you can give here.
Well, let me just make a broader comment first, and then I'll address your question. I mean, the war and what caused the war has inflicted huge damage on a country of nearly 30 million people, and it's going to take, you know, in the best possible case, it will take years to rebuild the damaged infrastructure. It will take a generation at least to build an economy in which everybody can make a decent living. But I'm afraid the recovery from the damage what's happened has done to Yemen's social and kind of interaction between the different groups in the country, fixing that is the work of a century. And you know, this is something people should think about before they start wars, particularly like the one that we've seen in Yemen. As you say, my job is to try to minimize the consequences of what's happened on the ordinary people of the country. And the positive thing to say is that it has been possible to stave off the very worst. You know, a year ago, I was saying that unless things change, there would be a huge famine in Yemen, and a famine involves massive loss of life in the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands, or the millions. That was a scenario which was a viable scenario. And the reason that hasn't happened is because, firstly, we have a huge relief operation, reaching, as I said earlier, something like 15 million people, by far the world's biggest relief operation, taking place in one of the world's most difficult operating environments, but also because it's been financed. And it's been financed largely by the countries of this region. 2/3 of the money we've raised this year, $3.2 billion, which is a lot of money, has come from this region, and 1/3 from the wider world. If people want to keep the humanitarian situation stable, then we're going to need a huge amount of money next year as well. This year, you know, we were looking for about $4 billion. Next year, we're looking for $3.2 billion. So I'm not saying that there's going to be a dramatic improvement, but I am saying that there is scope for some improvement. But this is against the context where the damage that's been done is going to be the work of generations to fix.
So, thank you, Mr. Lowcock. Rafat, a generation to fix. How can the Yemen economy, how can that generational project be expedited beyond the war?
I think that's where we need to seriously think, especially with the region, as Mark said, who will always be our only partners when it comes to the recovery and the reconstruction in terms of the funding, in terms of the financing, but in terms of the trade integration as well. I mean, beyond the region, this is not even now, it's historical always, the largest partners for Yemen are the region. And so if we don't start thinking about what is this vision, what is the project, you know, call it a Marshall Plan, call it whatever you want. But we need that vision, and we need the region and the partners in the region to buy into that, and to buy into that a better outcome for everyone involved in Yemen is not to find the different proxies that they want to support and fund and spend their money on, but to really find a way to stabilize the whole country, to create a viable and productive economy. And only with stability will the region benefit. But this continued looking for the different proxies that you can fund is only a destructive cycle that will never end.
Yes, thank you very much. I want to give, we have 8 minutes literally, and then I'm going to be kicked off stage by our colleagues from the Doha Forum. So I'm going to take only 3 people, and I would ask that they only be questions and be targeted to one person and very short, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maryam Al-Dhabhani. I'm an independent journalist and filmmaker, and I want to address the gentleman from Al Jazeera. Is it Saeed Thabit? I want to ask you, when was the last time you went back to Yemen? And I would respectfully disagree with the way you described the situation. It is more than what you said, and with all due respect, covering Yemen was not happening until the crisis in GCC, and then out of a sudden it became the interest, and an interest from a political perspective of showing that it's just certain specters or actors from abroad are the ones who are causing the chaos, but it's more than that. I was recently home and I made a film from Yemen, and I was shocked when I showed it abroad that even in the Arab countries, they don't know what's going on in Yemen, and they don't see us as equal human beings. They see us as a crisis. They see us as famine. They see us as death and cholera and everything that is terrible in the world. This thing is affecting everyone and affecting the future generation, and I feel that the media has been causing this tremendous destruction.
I think the idea is very clear, my dear.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Can I just ask the question?
I'm happy that there's a question in there.
Yes.
Please.
Being here in the forum, what do you think is going to contribute for Yemen and people in Yemen?
Thank you. Before we continue, we need to excuse Mr. Lowcock as he needs to leave, and thank you very much for your participation. So give him a hand. Can we take the question from the gentleman here, and then we can get back? Yes, the mic.
Thank you, moderator. My name is KP Fabian. I was India's ambassador to Qatar in the last millennium. And I had dealt with 2 Yemens when I was joint secretary, then they became 1. Now, my question is very simple. I honestly believe, but I could be wrong, I honestly believe that Saudi Arabia has been chasing the mirage in seeking military victory in Yemen. So I want to know when the panelists think that Saudi Arabia will recognize that it has been chasing the mirage and when it will stop.
Thank you very much. A last question from the third side of the room. I'm sorry, yeah, my mistake. There's nobody there. We'll give to Dr. Abdullah. Can you commit to a 1-minute question? That's
Thank you for the panelists. Unfortunately, I wanted to ask the Undersecretary of the United Nations about my question to the panelists. What are the prospects now of some kind of a breakthrough negotiation, because there is a fatigue in the 5th year of the war? There are discussions now between the Saudis and the Houthis, between the Saudis, and even Wall Street Journal talked about lowering the tension between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Who is responsible for really the disaster now, the almost famine, on the verge of a famine in Yemen? And what are the Houthis' strategy? Maybe Mr. Saeed Thabit could shed light on that. Are they really proxy of Iran? Because there are talks, and I'm finishing, there are talks in Washington that they are more or less more independent than what they are perceived to be. Is that correct? يعني هل الحوثيين بالفعل أتباع إيران ولا قاعد نبالغ أو في مبالغة بأنهم أتباع إيران، ولهذا السبب يعني هل نفضل نفاوض إيران ولا نفاوض الحوثيين؟
شكرا دكتور عبد الله. Always loaded questions from Dr. Abdullah. We start with Saeed, then Helen and Rafat.
فهمت الأخت أنها تتحدث عن الجزيرة وتغطياتها، هكذا فهمت صح؟ أنا طبعا في المقام هذا ليس في مقام قناة أو غيرها، لكن أوضح أنه هذه القناة مكاتبها كلها مغلقة ومطاردة من كل الأطراف، لا تشتغل بشكل طبيعي من خلال مراسليها، سواء كانت في المناطق التي يسيطر عليها الحوثيون ممنوعين، أو في المناطق التي يسيطر عليها السعوديون والإماراتيون أيضا ممنوعة. وبالتالي المقاربة في وضع غير طبيعي يظل حكم غير طبيعي، برغم أن الجزيرة ركزت وسلطت الأضواء كثيرا على الحالة الإنسانية وعلى قضايا المجاعة وقضايا
بالوقت فقط أستاذ سعيد، أمامنا 3 دقائق لنهاية
فقط. يعني هذا النقطة الثانية ما أدري السؤال الآخر.
دكتور عبد الله أظن كان عنده سؤال وكان في
اللي هو الوكلاء وغير وكلاء. أنا بقناعتي الحرب في اليمن قلنا ليست يمنية خالصة، هي حرب إقليمية دولية نفذتها أدوات داخلية. الحوثيون بالتأكيد هم وكلاء إيران، والدليل على ذلك الكلام الأمريكي الذي يقول عليه الأمريكيون بعض الأوساط غير دقيق بصراحة، لأنه الدولة الوحيدة التي سلمت سفارات بلد معترف بها شرعيا لجماعة مسلحة وإعطاء مكانة للحوثيين كسفراء يعملون فيها، والنزعة الثيوقراطية التي تتجه الحوثيين المشابهة للدور الإيراني في داخل الثورة الإيرانية أو في العراق، واضح هذا لا يحتاج إلى دليل أو إلى إثبات. والحوثيون أنفسهم يقولون نحن مرتبطون بشكل مباشر مع الإيرانيين سياسيا ولوجستيا وغيرها. لا يعني هذا أيضا تبرير الطرف الآخر. الحكومة الشرعية أيضا مرتهنة تماما بقرارها للسعودية والإمارات.
شكرا أستاذ سعيد. Helen, would you like to give some final thoughts?
Yeah, just a few final words. I think I don't totally agree with what Saeed says. I think that if the international involvement, whether it's Iranian or any other, stops, there will still be a war in Yemen, and the Houthis have their own objectives. But I think I'd just like to pick up on what has been said mainly by Rafat and by Mr. Lowcock, which is that once the internationalized war ends, we will be left very much with the situation as it was in 2015 when it started, with a few factors which make it that much worse. First, the worsening of the bitterness and the revenge feelings from all the incidents that have happened in those years. Secondly, the point that Rafat made earlier, the importance of the warlords and the whole, not only the war economy, but also the militarized youth who've been spent years where the only source of income was joining one militia or another. And thirdly, a point that Mr. Lowcock mentioned briefly, is the deep social fragmentation that has now affected, I think, the whole of the country and not just Yemen. And finally, to a political element, which is that the political parties that remain on standing at the end of this war will basically be the Ansar Allah, i.e. the Houthi movement, and probably Al-Islah, because the General People's Congress is also very much deteriorated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rafat, we finish with you.
Sure, just maybe a final thought. I mean, the challenges are insurmountable. There's huge issues that we have to deal with, but I think, as always, you know, the million miles journey starts with a step, and I think if the first step of having this de-escalation going towards a path of peace, at least, will start addressing all of the other issues. So I think the key here is if Saudi Arabia, being the largest player in this region and in this conflict that is happening, if Saudi Arabia switches the role to being a champion for peace, to being a convener for everyone, and I think Saudi is still the only country that can play that role in Yemen and can call everyone, and everyone will go, all the Yemeni parties. And we see it with the Houthis now, although I've been saying this for 3 years, and people are saying, no, the Houthis will not grow even if Saudi calls for it. But we see as soon as Saudi is willing to talk, everyone will be willing to talk. So I think if this transformation happens, if Saudi changes that role from being a side in the conflict into being the convener and champion for peace, similar to what happened in the 60s and how they transformed their role, and that's what ended the conflict in the 60s. That would be the first step, and then we can start addressing all the other issues.
Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking Mark, Helen, Saeed, and Rafat, and thank you very much for your attendance and participation.